capitalist mode of doing things. That, to me, is a very important distinction. So many of the struggles that I see often are embedded in neighborhoods, but again, it's how the neighborhood construes its relation to other neighborhoods that becomes absolutely critical. Are there alliances? And I think that neighborhood organization is terribly, terribly important. And there's almost no way, it seems to me, that you can envisage a political struggle that didn't involve strong organization at the neighborhood level. We saw some of this in Spain at the end of the Franco era. There are many, many examples of this sort of struggle. But then the big problem is what we geographers talk about when we start to argue about what happens when you jump scale. What happens when you move from a neighborhood struggle to, say, a citywide struggle? How does that work? What happens when you start to move from a citywide struggle to other scales, to say, a bio-regional struggle? And that then comes up to the question of, to what degree the struggles also over questions of environment and use and the like. So there are many issues of that kind. The difficulty right now, I mean, I was not a participant in the Occupy movement in New York. I went on sabbatical about 10 days before they occupied Zuccotti Square, and I was living right in a rather remote rural area of Argentina. So I sort of was watching it all from a distance. I've come up with, I think, some impressions and some comparisons. The Occupy movement was animated largely by a certain segment in the population. It was very much centered on from New York, largely white youth, younger generation population, not necessarily youth, but younger generation. Many of whom were in, if you loosely call it, the kind of were in cultural production, and very much animated by either an autonomista or an anarchist kind of understanding of the world. The result of this was a taking up of certain kind of organizational forms, the assemblies, and a deep commitment to horizontalist forms of organization. And, from my perspective, I think horizontalist forms of organization are very important, but they're limited in what they can accomplish. At some point or other, you have to deal with the problem of hierarchy or with layering, the nested hierarchies of assemblies and so on. I think that by prolonging the occupation, I mean, I mentioned February the 15th of 2003, it was a one-day event and it disappeared. A lot of social movements have been massive for one day. But they've had no lasting power. One of the good things about Occupy was it occupied and stayed there for some time. And it made people change the conversation so that in the United States it became possible to talk about social inequality, where it had not been possible to talk about this before. And then it even led the Democratic Party to start to co-opt a little bit the rhetoric of social inequality. And Obama has taken it up a little bit in his campaign stances. So there was a real accomplishment with that, but then once you got evicted from the space, then what do you do? And I think they just don't know what to do. There was a May Day march. It was reasonably impressive, but it didn't really. Again, it was a one-day event, and I don't think anybody had any idea what to do afterwards. This contrasts with a movement that I came to really admire a great deal in the short time I was exposed to it, which is the Chilean students' movement. all of the public universities are occupied, have been occupied for a year. They're now not open, partially gone back to things. But the student movement clearly understood, this comes back to what I was saying earlier, that it was not simply about their issue. What they had lived through was, Pinochet came and brutally imposed neoliberal conditions. Democratization comes in, concertation comes in, even gains power, but it does not change the conditions that Pinochet had left behind. And the student movement is clear that they want to get rid of Pinochet-ism, if you like. I wish the British were as clear that they need to get rid of Thatcherism. And in the US, they need to get rid of Reaganism. But that comes back to the question, that's not necessarily to take a completely anti-capitalist stance. That is, on the other hand, I think that broadening the terms of the struggle, so that you say, well, our project is to go after the neoliberal city, or whatever you want to call it, and move towards an alternative kind of city, call it an anti-capitalist city, if you like. What would that look like? How would it be fed? How would it be housed? How would activities be coordinated within it? And when you talk to people in the Occupy movement who were so concerned about, democratic debates that go on for hours, and I say, well, look, frankly, I wouldn't want you in charge of a nuclear power station. And we actually live in a society where there's a lot of tightly coupled systems which need command and control structures very immediately. So I was asking one of the great proponents of this, I said, how come next time you fly the Atlantic, you're halfway across the Atlantic and the pilot comes on and says, well, we're going to have to stack here for a bit because they've decided to have an assembly amongst the air traffic controllers in New York City and decide which airline should be privileged and which is the most socialist of the airlines, or something, How would you feel about that? And you kind of go, well, obviously, this is not the sort of thing that can work. An air traffic control system has to be tightly controlled, organized system. And there are many parts of the economy we now live in, whether we like it or not, which are of that sort. If things go wrong in a nuclear power station, you've got to start moving in very fast, and command and control structures, and who has to do what, where, has to be clearly identified, clearly understood. And so there are many issues of that kind, and there's no point in you saying to me that you don't like nuclear power or something, and you say, well, sorry, those stations are out there, and they're going to be there forever, and something has to be done about controlling what else going on in them. So you don't have any choice. So I think there's a certain lack of practicality in the oppositional movement right now, and what I call a fetishism of organizational form, which has taken over, and I think that it's deeply wounding to their capacity, I think, to go to a different level. That's the Occupy movement, whereas the Chilean student movement doesn't have problems with that. They have leadership, but they have democracy. There's a way of holding leaders accountable, but at the same time, there's a way in which leaders can lead. And it's clear who you're talking to, and what again, there are things that get done that way, and there are orchestrations of tasks. And it turned out the only Occupy movement I really looked at very closely was the London one, and they had a very clear division of labour. I mean, there was a library over here, and there was a medical tent over here, and there was another organisation here, and these were managed by people who have managerial structures. So don't pretend that this is something that it's not. You've got to say, well, this is what it is, and don't pretend you're not a vanguard movement, because you are. So let's so there are certain ideological barriers which seem to have gotten in the way, and then there's always confusion about how to conceptualize state power. You know, some of it is so radically anti-statist. And then you get these crazy things, like the last book by Michael Hart and Tony Negri. I think on page 285, they smashed the state. And then 5 pages later, the state is actually delivering universal health care and a universal standard of living to everybody. And you kind of go, well, you just smashed it 3 pages before. How the hell is it going to do that? You just smashed it. You know, so you know, there's a certain incoherence, it seems to me, within the left over these kinds of questions. And it's not as if the state is unproblematic, because no, it's deeply problematic, and the whole history of what the state's been about is deeply problematic. In the same way that, you know, the history of unions has been deeply problematic in many instances. And so, you know, but you just can't say, I don't want to talk to a trade unionist ever again, because there are certain things like reformist movements within there. So I'm kind of sort of saying that you've got to come up with some you know, way of organizing. You know, and of course, obviously, this is going to use the social media, but the social media is a double-edged sword. Amongst most American students, I think it's just a weapon of mass distraction. You know, kids don't know there's a revolution going on in Egypt because they're so concerned about who's screwing whom where, you know, that they just can't, you know, they just can't, don't have time to recognize that anything else is going on in the world, you know, and so it's a double-edged sword. It can be used in all these kind of positive ways, but then the telephone was the same way, you know. So you know, it depends how it can be used, and there are lots of possibilities involved in it, very important ones, but on the other hand, it really needs people to take care of the possibilities, and at some point or other, people have to be on the street. It's one thing to be on the social media and say, oh, you know, blah, 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 I think this and this and this, but, you know, 1 million people twittering on the social media is not the same as 1 million people in the street. And 1 million people in the street have a completely different kind of political meaning and political effect. So to me, these are the sorts of issues that have to be sort of evolved over time. And I mentioned something like the Chilean student movement, but then there are other organizations. For instance, one that does bridge the urban-rural divide would be the landless peasants movement in Brazil, the MST. It is as much implanted in urban as it is in rural politics, and links the two together. So I don't think there's any real problem over that. So you know. But we have to be thinking about these things, and we have to be thinking about a reconceptualization of who is the proletariat. And, you know, for too long there's been a Marxist kind of fetish view that it's a factory worker who's the centre of the proletariat, and that's the avant-garde that's going to make history. Well, I think the proletariat, I would define the proletariat these days as all those people who are producing and reproducing urban life. Okay. Now that is a completely different definition of the proletariat. And whereas the classical proletariat has disappeared largely from you know, many American cities, that proletariat I've defined is all over the place. And it needs new forms of organisation, it needs new imagination about its forms of organisation. And those forms of organisation are springing up all over the place. There's an organisation of workers now in Baltimore, which does not call itself a union, but calls itself a human rights organisation. And you can be, you know, kind of leery about human rights talk, and I am too, but on the other hand, they use this tactically, because this allows them to do all kinds of things that they couldn't do as unions. It means that they can have other people in their organisation, you don't have to go through some certification process to be a human rights organisation. And they have a territorial strategy. That is, they're trying to liberate the whole downtown sort of inner harbour place from awful labour practices. And they declare it a living wage zone. They declare it a worker rights zone. And they invade it every now and again and disrupt it every now and again. And they're trying to sort of put tremendous pressure on all of the companies that operate in there to sign on to a code of conduct in the way that the domestic workers succeeded in getting the state legislature to pass a code of proper conduct in relationship to the employment of domestic workers. So you can start to organise those things, and it's perfectly possible. And these new forms of organisation really, I think, are terribly important. Did I miss something? Or was that?